Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome North Carolina Department of Transportation Board Member Thomas Taft.
Good morning. As you just heard, I am Thomas Taft. I'm the Division of Transportation Board Member from Division 2 out of Greenville. This is a really exciting session about reducing vehicle miles traveled, why it's important, and what are the strategies that can help us do it. We have some great speakers lined up, so let's get into it, please. As we get started, make sure to open the Transportation Summit app and answer this session's poll question. We'll kick off our panel discussion with the results of that poll. Also, please remember to keep your mask on except when eating or drinking. We want to make sure we are doing our part to keep people safe and healthy during this session. Colin and Heather, two staff members of NCDOT, will kick us off, followed by our panel discussion, and then time for more questions. Colin and Heather, please.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Nice to see everybody here. Thomas just introduced me. My name is Colin Mellor. I work for NCDOT's Environmental Policy Unit. There's a few people out here that know me, and a few of them have had a chance to meet my wonderful wife. For those that don't know me and haven't met my wife, I'm punching above my weight. I'm going to tell you that right now. And that only gets exacerbated as time goes on. A couple years ago, she was awarded a doctorate degree in education. And so now, on paper, she's smarter than me and certainly more beautiful than I am. So. But we do have a couple things in common. We're both public servants.
If I could change it out to use that, please.
Oh, sure. Is mic's not working? You're not going to make me feed back now, are you?
Try not to. Just a second. Let's try his loft, please.
All right, we're better now? Okay. So, my wife and I, things in common, yes. We're both public servants, okay? She works as an early childhood educator in Chapel Hill, and I work for the DOT. And the similarities there continue. We both work in professions where everybody, all of you guys, all members of the public have a little bit of experience. You all have, not everybody, but most people here have children. You've raised those kids, you've educated them a little bit, and I know, don't deny it, that you've emailed or gone and spoken to a teacher and given them a few pointers on how they might better reach the kids. NCDOT employees here have all heard the speech, as I have. Everybody's on the roads. Colin, what you need to do is just synchronize the lights on Capitol Boulevard. If you can do that, that's just going to eliminate rush hour traffic in the morning. And what are we doing in Melbourne? I'm on the wrong side of the road with this diverging down. Everybody's got an opinion. And so I bring all this up because at the beginning of 2020, in the spring of 2020, I find myself convening a committee on VMT reduction. And I know very little about VMT reduction and VMTs, other than the fact that I travel VMTs, I make VMTs. And in fact, I may be the worst offender. I live in Orange County, and I commute to Wake County most days for work. So, can I get my slides up on the screen here, please? There we go. Oh, those are Heather's. Are we out of order? Mic problems, slides in the wrong place.
It's the real world equivalent of being on mute.
That's right. I know, I had that already, haven't I?
With technology, we're getting used to this, right? Blips.
The slides will make this so much better. They'll be worth waiting for.
Heather, could you go ahead and go first?
I can. We're going to be nimble, which now I'm not sure how I get to my slides, so let's see. Oh, there we go. So Colin has introduced himself. My name is Heather Hildebrandt. I also work for NCDOT in the Transportation Planning Division. And unlike Colin, I actually have a fairly extensive background in VMT reduction. I had 17 years with the Division of Air Quality, where I worked on alternative fuels and TDM measures and things of that nature. So this is something that I'm passionate about and something that I'm glad to be a part of. So just to give you an idea about the VMT Task Force, Colin will be talking about the study which kind of preceded the VMT Task Force. But the VMT Task Force is an ad hoc group. We come together as needed. It's comprised of different planning organizations, stakeholders with respect to supporting transit or cycling or pedestrian facilities. We met currently, or the first time in October, and our current focus is the development of a Vmt Reduction Toolkit. So to look on the, what the Vmt Toolkit is going to look like, this is a sample page of the toolkit. And it basically expands on what came out of that, that study that Colin will be talking about here shortly. To actually develop something of an interactive tool, web-based, where people can actually go down the menu of options, pick what's going to work for their place, their either workplace or their municipality, and then also provide some funding information, because we all know that it's not just the technology or the knowledge, but it's also how we get these programs funded. One of the other things that we've done within NCDOT that kind of has delved really well with this task force, as well as the study that was done, is we have partnered with other organizations into looking at what are the drivers of VMT. It's really great to look at the solutions, but until you figure out what the drivers are, it can be hard to choose the proper solution for VMT reduction. There was a study that was prepared by Smart Growth America that we were happy to say that it very much aligned with what was done previously in the VMT study, but it also highlighted how important it was that not only do we develop these TDM measures, but that we look at other sources of VMT growth. And a lot of times that comes into areas outside of the DOT, whether it be planning, infill. We talked, I think, at the earlier session about the 15-minute cities, how important it is to kind of plan for that growth where people can take modes other than single occupancy vehicles. And then this is just kind of a third point that we're going to be talking about with the VMT Task Force is looking at the VMT per registered driver. We know that North Carolina population is increasing. It's increasing rather quickly. And VMT per driver, in general is increasing. But we need to get a better handle on, is the actual individual driver driving more? Are they driving less? Because again, teasing out the information will enable us to choose the strategies that are going to best reduce the VMT overall. And what I would be normally segueing into is our panel discussion. We have 4 of the panelists that are members of our VMT task force here to talk to you today. But hopefully we'll be able to get to Colin's slides on the VMT reduction. So let's see. We'll see what happens. Good luck, Colin.
Thanks. Right. Oh, excuse me for a minute.
Wait a minute.
Oh my gosh. So I have to improvise here for a little bit until the slide deck gets up there. The slide deck is background. So when I left you all, it was the beginning of 2020, early spring of 2020, and I was helping put together a task force or a committee to study VMT reduction strategies for North Carolina. Me, the novice, or perhaps the worst offender, I surrounded myself with people that knew way more than I did. We have got great transportation planners and traffic modelers at NCDOT. We got a consultant on board, Stantec team came in to help us. And then we reached out to the people that we work with daily, the people that live and work within the acronyms that everybody's throwing around here, MPOs, RPOs, and COGs. So again, for some of the people here that may not be up with everything, although I think most people here are, TDM, Travel Demand Model, VMT, Vehicle Miles Traveled, MPO is a metropolitan planning organization, RPO is a rural planning organization, and COGs are councils of government. So we put together a committee of these people to really delve into the strategies and the TDM model measures that we could analyze in North Carolina to look at VMT reduction. I see some slides. Now we've got to hope they advance, because we've already gone over who I am. There we go. So the study had two phases. The first one, basically a literature review looking where North Carolina is, establishing the baseline and how we compare to the nation. We had an active case study going on in the fact that COVID was just beginning, and so how was that affecting the way that people traveled nationally and within the state. And then we took the VMT strategies that are out there in the literature and the research, and we sent those out to a broader group of traffic modelers and planners and TDM experts. And then we moved into the testing phase. We took those strategies, I think the strategies that we sent out, there were 25 strategies that we sent out for our TDM expert survey, and we asked them to rank them on factors like ease of implementation and cost of implementation and overall effectiveness. And out of those 25, we came back with, we aimed to get a top 10. I believe there's 11. There must have been a tie in there somewhere. But we got the top 11 from that survey, and we packaged them together, realizing that no one strategy was going to be effective on its own. We do better if we group these strategies together. And then we took those packages, the groups of strategies, and we ran them through two travel demand models. One from the French Broad River MPO, which is the area around Asheville, and the other through the Capital Area MPO, which is the planning organization here in Raleigh. And the idea then was to contrast a little bit. These were two robust, established TDM, transportation demand models, and a comparison between a more urban-based model and the Asheville model, which while had some urban aspects, was really more of a rural model. So, background. Total VMT, North Carolina trending the same way as the nation. On the rise up until about 2008, 2009, plateau a little bit to do associated with the recession, and then somewhere around 2012, we're increasing again. When we start normalizing those results to North Carolina, we start seeing that North Carolina is a little bit above the national average in VMT per capita. And going into the numbers a little bit more, if we start normalizing those numbers starting at 2012 when the latest incline started occurring, we see that for the national average, in rural VMT, we're about the same, but in urban VMT, North Carolina starts to go a little bit higher again. And this is no surprise to anybody. North Carolina is a growing state. There's a lot of people coming into the state, and most of those people are going to our more urban metropolitan areas. Again, vehicle use by category here, national versus North Carolina. North Carolina mimicking the national averages again, with the exception of public transportation. And again, while we've got multiple excellent public transit systems across the state of North Carolina, in general, the state's a more rural state, and so those transit systems can't be exploited quite as well as they are in other more urban states, and that's the difference in those numbers there. So these are the TDM packages or groups of VMT strategies that we group together into the four groups: a forward-thinking, transit-based, environmental, and a low-cost. And this is a quick look at the results. And I'm moving through this quickly. I encourage everybody here who hasn't looked at the report to go and find the report. I'm going to show you a link in just a minute. But really, you just have to Google or search NCDOT VMT study, and it'll be the first link that comes up. So it's pretty easy to find. It's about 100 pages long, but I think it's really well written. It's written at a level that I think everybody can understand, plus the technical part of it for those practitioners that really want to delve into things. But the results here were interesting to me, the novice, on a couple levels. First of all, the environmental package was the best scoring on both models, and that makes sense because that's the package that really took people out of their cars and tried to put them either in public transit or in other modes of transportation, walking and cycling. The other thing here that I thought was interesting is the y-axis. The numbers here, the percentage difference from the base model, don't look particularly big, but Joseph Hummer, Dr. Joseph Hummer, who was one of the people on the committee, made a point when we were discussing some of these things that hit home to me, and what I want to put out to everybody here is that while these initial numbers are small, if we start looking at even a 2% change in the rush hour traffic around Raleigh, we're making a big difference already. And if we start extrapolating that statewide, then we're really starting to make some differences. And so even some of these, what appear to be small percentages are significant differences. And then the other point that really came home to me, and one that I'd like to get everybody here to think about as we move into the discussion here and as you leave the room and go out, is that what we're talking about here are changes in behavior. And so these particular packages that people are looking to implement potentially, we're trying to change behavior. And as that behavior changes, it'll snowball. And then as a transportation agency, we can respond to that, and we can bring the infrastructure, we can make the planning decisions that will support that. This is a link to the report. Take a quick snapshot of it if you need, or commit it to memory. But like I say, Google NCDOT VMT study, and it'll pop right up. And I encourage you all to take a look at it because it's pretty interesting, even if you're not a traffic demand modeler. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Thomas.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you, Colin and Heather. I hope everyone has a better appreciation now for all the work that goes into the VMT policy creation. Our work at DOT is only a small part of this equation. To give us a better look at how to implement vehicle miles traveled reduction policies across the state, I'd like to turn it over to our esteemed panelist speakers. Bo Mills is the Director of Urban Affairs for the North Carolina Metro Mayors Coalition and the NC League of Municipalities. Hey, Bo, thank you.
Good to see you.
Online, we have Nina Schlossberg-Landis. She is a former member of the Board of Transportation. She's a member of the National Board of the Environmental Defense Action Fund and currently sits on the board of the North Carolina League of Conservation Voters. Hi, Nina. And finally, we have Lydia McIntyre. Lydia is a senior transportation planning engineer, at the Greensboro Metropolitan Planning Organization. Hi, Lydia. And then in person, we have Patrick Flanagan, who I know well. Patrick is a regional planner at the Down East and Cape Fear RPO. And please join me in welcoming our panelists today.
Thanks,
Patrick,
how's
thank
it
you.
going?
I think the easiest thing to do is start our conversation with an open question. And I assume that I'm going to start with Nina. I'm going to go left to right. And what do you believe are the current barriers to reducing vehicle miles traveled?
Well, that's a great question, and let me just start by saying hello to all of you, and for those of you that I know and have worked with for so many years, I miss you, and just wish you all good things. I've been involved in transportation for a little over 20 years. My first board service was in 2001, and in 2001, we were talking about vehicle miles traveled reduction or reducing the growth of VMT. I've served on a number of study committees, legislative study committees, internal study committees, committees that are associated with various MPOs. I don't think our barrier is information and data. I think it's important to do those studies as a foundation for making decisions. But I think the real barrier is how we engage the public to support the idea of making the shifts that are needed. engaging in transportation choice, shifting over to a different financing model for our infrastructure, which is absolutely going to be necessary. So we have to engage the public in a more robust conversation about it so that they can provide the support that's needed in the political realm to make some of the decisions that are going to have to be made if we're going to fund transportation adequately in the future, and if we're going to provide real transportation choice to people in a meaningful way so that they can make a choice to get out of a single occupancy vehicle and onto a different mode.
Excellent, excellent. Lydia, you want to take it next?
Yes, I think Nina made great points. I mean, the first thing that came to my mind is convenience. So I look at myself as a transportation planning engineer. Have I taken our bus here in Greensboro before? Yes, a couple of times. Is it easy access for me? No. So she hit on a lot of great points, whether it's the mindset, and I think Colin kind of mentioned that, talking about behavior. Behavior changes. And when we get to talking about behavior changes, that's not an easy thing. People are used to their daily routines, and I think people want convenience, right? So I have 3 boys. So if I think about, if I'm going to switch to transit, or if I want to be able to, my boys to be able to walk to school a short distance, is it convenient? Is there access? Is there funding to adequately provide that service? So for me, I think about mindset, convenience, as well as funding.
Thank you. You know, it's really interesting to hear you talk about the convenience and to talk about sort of the hierarchy of which particular methods will work to reduce vehicle miles traveled, right? An obvious one is public transport. You know, in some ways, in my mind, the lighter lift there is simply carpooling, right? Making an effort to, you know, not have a single occupant car. And even that requires a behavior change, and that only requires, you know, yourself to make that decision. So, Patrick?
So from the rural perspective, when I think about this, I think the biggest barrier is just sheer distance. In the urban areas, it's a lot easier to daisy chain your trips, so you may not be carpooling, but you're going to work and then going to the grocery store and then going to the gym and then going back home. In the rural areas, your grocery store and work may be in 2 different directions and are much more spread out. And so just the sheer distance that rural areas have to travel to do their day-to-day life is a little bit harder just from the number of miles that you're traveling, because it's just further to get anywhere.
Instead of the 15-minute city, it's the 15-mile county, right?
That's exactly,
in
that's
every
exactly
direction,
right.
which is
Yep.
really difficult. You know, I mean, I
Absolutely.
think that's a tough one. Bo?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I work with the larger cities in the state. I think one of the biggest challenges around VMT is just the patterns of human behavior, the desire to live in a larger house, things like that. We thought before the pandemic that things were changing. People wanted to be in more densely packed communities. You know, post-COVID world, I mean, we heard it this morning, things are changing. We're not really sure where we're headed, but I think probably the biggest challenge on VMT is housing and the way we develop our communities and the way we do mixed-use developments. I think we found that people really like to be able to get stuff easily with, you know, the 5-minute city, I think that's probably the biggest challenge we face right now is the housing questions associated with commuting and work and things like that. I was telling Patrick earlier that, and this may be getting into your next question, but post-COVID, I mean, people are just not going to the office, for example. You know, my wife works at a federal agency that has a suburban campus here in the Triangle, and they're probably never going to go to work 5 days a week again. I mean, talk about reducing VMT, that's huge.
Yeah.
That is a big change.
And hopefully it actually goes to reducing and not just being replaced with another, you know, another reason, to your point on sort of the daisy chaining of things. If you start to remove the office visit, you know, does that actually end up to a reduction, or is that replaced with, you know, a gym visit or, you know,
Right.
something else? But I think not. I mean, I think there's a real possibility that we do see an actual impact, so long as we're vocal about the positives that come from that, besides not going to the office, which
Right,
I think we all appreciate. Well, that's very helpful. Yeah, to your point, sort of in the same vein, you know, it's interesting to me to almost ask the question to myself, you know, how much am I willing to reduce my own vehicle miles traveled as a single person, as an organization, whether it's my private time or my public life, and almost it'd be interesting to kind of put that question to everyone, how much are you willing to reduce, and how much do you think, I don't want to speculate on the average citizen, but how much do we think people are willing to reduce that, and feel free, anyone, to take that.
It's, I switched jobs in the last couple of years and went to a different part of the state, and where I was before, I had an hour-long commute. But there were folks that I worked with that were in my same town that we would occasionally carpool, which was great. But we worked jobs where, I had to go to a night meeting to present to a town council, and somebody else was going to some other town. And so we would fall out of that habit. And it would be very easy to just go 3 weeks and look up and go, wait a minute, we were carpooling a little while ago, and now we just, one night, kind of threw it all out of balance. And so it's a huge hurdle to get into that mindset and stay into that mindset and be vigilant about it, really.
I think Nina had a comment.
Well, I think a couple of things. One, I am not a millennial. I'm a baby boomer. And, but millennials and those who are younger, I believe are beginning to really, as Dr. King said, understand the fierce urgency of now. And that is that our climate is changing. We're seeing very radical shifts in our climate, and we know that transportation is contributing about 25% of greenhouse gases, and we have to do something. Thank goodness we have the governor's executive order that's going to shift more cars to electric, which is such an important step. But it's going to take a long time to make the transition from a combustion engine world into an electric vehicle or electric vehicle world. So I think that there is a support among people for making the shift. Now, once they want to make a shift, but as Lydia said, if there's not something to hop to that's convenient, it's a huge barrier. I don't know if you saw the gentleman from Wilson talk about what they're doing in Wilson this morning, but man, I was so impressed by that. But the example he gave of a waitress trying to get to her child or his child who is sick in school and having to take transit, and that's a 4 or 5 hour event in their day. That is a huge obstacle for people. So if we can make the choices convenient and more efficient, and you couple that with the sort of the ethic that I think more and more people are feeling about a need to do something, I think we can make some real progress.
Yes, I think we just have to, I think about it being relevant. So when you make it relevant, so she talked about the millennials, which they seem to be a little more in touch and a little more environmentally concerned or politically or socially concerned about things. And I think about, even if you think about children, a lot of times when we think about behavior changes, sometimes we think about starting with the children. So, it's my children who are saying, hey, make sure we recycle this. We need to save Mother Earth. They don't necessarily understand what impacts we are seeing and what the scientists are evaluating, but they have this knowledge, this basic premise that we need to do things different. Now, they haven't recognized that transportation, what their mom is doing, has impacts, so they haven't gotten me there yet, but they have a relevancy that they think that, hey, we do need to make some changes. So it's almost like we have to make it relevant to the people. That they understand that we have to make a change, and what can we do? And even if we understand that one change or small change, even if we do it one day a week, that has an impact.
I'll just sort of add to that, thinking about our economy, growing our economy, attracting new businesses to the state. I think some of the great successes we're having now are bringing in high-tech companies, and it's a more human approach to transportation. And we heard this in the last panel, human-centric, thinking about transportation from a human perspective, not just moving vehicles, but what do people want? And one of the things we've heard, the mention of millennials, I think that future employees and future employers want to be able to offer choices. They want different choices, and that's where we invest our transportation dollars, which there are not enough of them, by the way. There's not enough money to do what we need to do. We need to be very strategic, and we need to think about how do we provide those choices that will attract the labor force and the businesses that we want to come to North Carolina. And I think we have a great opportunity to continue to grow. We have a lot of the right elements with the beautiful environment, with the education systems, and a lot of success we've seen. But if we don't start thinking strategically about providing choices on transportation, we're trying to do that now. I think we've got a long way to go. And in our centralized transportation system that we have in North Carolina, it's going to be hard to adapt. And the fact that we have this summit is a sign, a positive sign. We're having this conversation is a positive sign that North Carolina wants to be at the leading edge of adapting to a changing future. But we need to really be nimble, and that was one of the takeaways we had from the last panel. Nimble, we have to be nimble.
Well, it seems like the tools that we have to do this continue to become more available, and there's more of them. And one thing, particularly to some of Lydia's comments, I think it'd be really interesting to see, and I'm sure this has been done, but maybe advertise a little better, the connection between that 1 day a week using mass transit, that 1 day a week using a carpool, and having a direct tie to, hey, if you do that, like, I don't know if anybody's booked an airline ticket lately when they, I think United does it, where they show your carbon footprint from that trip, right? And you have an opportunity to offset that. To me, that's like a visceral, physical, okay, you don't really think about it as you're, flying, 30,000 feet. You're not really thinking about that impact, but as you buy that ticket and you have an opportunity to offset it, whether it's through, some sort of a carbon offset or a tree planting, I think it would be really interesting to show the connection between, even if it's a small reduction, right? Because if you ask people to, okay, I need everybody to commit to taking, a carpool or public transit every day, the pushback's going to be intense and it's an unattainable thing. But if you say once a week, this is how much carbon how much you're reducing your carbon footprint by, and I think that would be and make it in an easy to digest way for millennials, for kids, for all of us, right? It doesn't just apply to them. In fact, maybe it needs to apply to the older generation as opposed to millennials who seem to be more aware of it and more concerned about it. So, very very helpful.
I think that's good, Taff, because that made me think of an example for Amazon. Like, I used to just order because it was convenient, right? But now that they showed me, hey, if you package it together, we can save this much emissions and our trucks aren't running. So now I'm a little more aware and not so quick to hit that button. And just to piggyback on one thing that Bo was saying about being nimble, I just think about partnerships. So, like, it may not be enough for some people just to hear, hey, we need to reduce our carbon emission or our footprint, but it may be that there may be some other thing that they are interested in that we connect it to. Maybe safety for me is something that I think about. There's a lot of different partners or getting people to jobs. We're talking a lot about equity now. So it's different ways that we need to, I think, branch out and think about who can we partner with to make this happen. It'll be a win-win for all of us.
Well, and
I'd
again,
also like to.
please. No, Nina, go ahead.
Well, I think it's also important. Sometimes this is the elephant in the room. Nothing happens without investment. And I know that just from all my work with MPOs and RPOs over the years, there is sort of a frustration that when it comes to using our transportation dollars for things that are non-highway related, sometimes people run into a little bit of a wall on that. I noted in one of my conversations with the Vmt Task Force that when I first started on the Board of Transportation in 2001, we saw a pie chart. And in that pie chart, there's how much we spend on each thing that we do at DOT. In 2001, 7% of our budget was spent on things other than highway-related activities, which include aviation, ferries, public transportation, passenger rail. All those things, bike ped, all those things into that 7% slice. That slice has not changed. Now, there are policies. I mean, we've made tremendous progress at DOT. There are policies, our Complete Streets policy, which I think all of us are very proud of. There are lots of ways that we can incorporate sidewalks and pathways and things into our highway dollars. But I still think that if we want to get where we are saying we want to go, we have to make some very intentional decisions about how we are going to fund those activities and how we're going to partner with our municipalities, with our cities and towns in North Carolina.
Yeah. Well, part of me, initially I'm sort of thinking these small bites, right, is one way to get there. But I also think there are some really large initiatives that, we don't need to lose sight of in conjunction with the smaller bites. I mean, rail is probably the most obvious, whether it's, light rail, commuter rail, or even something more long distance. And I know something that obviously here in Raleigh, it's talked about a lot. To me, one of the most interesting things in the world, or in our state maybe I should say, is just what's happened along the light rail in Charlotte and the continued growth of that in different directions and the acceptance of it, right? I mean, it really has, we don't have to look far to prove out that concept. Obviously there's a lot of difficulty, and for good reason. I mean, it's not an easy thing to pull off, but it's really interesting. So what do we think the barriers, kind of to segue a little bit off of a light rail comment, what are the barriers, do we think, to the average person's resistance? And that's actually not in my canned question, but I really think there's a resistance to public transit. Some of it's out of convenience. What are the other things that we think are causing people to sort of not take advantage of all these great public transportation options we have?
I mean, I'll start. It's not always convenient. I mean, we heard the story that Wilson, that they mentioned in the last panel about someone, it's taking 3 hours to leave your office, go get your kid, then take them to the doctor. I mean, that's just not feasible. And they had a really fascinating solution to that from a municipal perspective. And I think that's part of it. The second thing is we have not invested as heavily in public transportation in North Carolina. For a state where almost all the population growth is focused in metropolitan regions, I think we need to really take a deep breath and think about, wait a minute, maybe we need to think about a changing demographic for our state, changing economy that requires more investments in public transportation that will help it become more convenient, easier to use. Some of our cities and regions are thinking about it. I think of, obviously you mentioned the light rail in Charlotte, and we're seeing the housing develop around that, so that's a successful model. I'm also excited about the BRT development that's taking place here in Raleigh, and I think that's also an innovative, cost-effective way to provide more convenience in one of our growing cities. So I think just thinking about more investments, a stronger partnership between cities and the state, I think would be a big help to that.
Yeah. Excellent. Patrick?
So, thinking about the rural perspective again, there's often something, a individual mindset that goes along with living in a rural area. There's a sort of independence that goes along with that, and that's why they live in the rural area, because they want to be kind of out there on their own, if you will, or have that feeling that they're not, in the big metro area with everybody else. And that kind of ties into a mindset of right along with the personal individual vehicle and the freedom that brings. And it just is another expression of that kind of individualism that often goes with kind of living in a rural area. And so here we get back to some sort of, we have to change that, we have to tweak that a little bit, whether it be, again, some kind of, your carbon footprint that you're putting on the earth as you do that. Can you make a change one day a week? Or just education about what it would mean if you didn't drive one day and you carpooled with your neighbor. Or we have to think about this also from you got to change hearts and minds a little bit, and create some acceptance of this and make it something that people realize is a choice that they want to make And it doesn't have to be an everyday choice, but a couple times a week, one day a week, actually makes a difference.
Yeah, yeah. Lydia? Oh, go ahead, Nina, please.
Nina can-
Well, to Patrick's point, which I think is such a good one, there isn't a one size fits all for North Carolina. We know that North Carolina is an incredibly diverse state, and we're one of the most rural states. With all of our huge metropolitan areas, we still are a very rural state in terms of where our population is. So I think that's a great point. Both Bo and I had the privilege of being Eisenhower Fellows, and my fellowship was in the European Union, and so I spent 3 months in in Europe, mostly in Germany and a couple other countries, but I never got into a car. Now, I'm not saying that we can become Europe, and I'm not even close to advocating that. However, there are lessons that we can learn from that. If these transportation options are convenient, well-funded, and robust, it actually provides people more freedom because they have more than one way that they can get to where they need to go. And oftentimes, because of congestion, which is a reason to reduce the growth of VMT, you can get there faster. So I think it's, if we do what we need to do in terms of adequately funding some of these choices, then the choice for people to shift to a non-SOV choice will be an easy one.
That was SOV, not SOB, is that correct?
Oh, single occupancy.
I'm kidding. Lydia?
I'll just mention that mindset, like in terms of mindset, that public transportation or even walking is not just for low income or minorities. A lot of times you can see that divide there, and I won't say it's necessarily just in terms of the mindset along racial lines or ethnic background, but there is a mindset that transit is only for certain people who maybe can't afford a car. But we are seeing the shift with our younger generation where some are saying, I don't want a car. I don't desire a car. I want to live in a place where I can get to access. I'm willing to pay higher rent to be able to have access to public transportation that's quick and easy. But some of it is the shifting of mindset that transit can be for everyone. I look at, for us, with GTA, our Greensboro Transit Authority versus PART, Piedmont Authority for Regional Transportation, we have two different type of riders there. That ride or take those services. So a part of it is making it, yes, convenient, but also understanding that it's safe and a great way to get around.
To piggyback on that real quick, in the rural areas, most of the transit is demand response. And there's a perception that's a little bit different, and it's an age gap. It's seen as the public transit for elderly people to go to the doctors or go to dialysis. And so it's a different kind of perception, but that perception remains. It's available to anybody, but it absolutely has that, that's the old person bus. And that's another change that can, education, just let people know that anybody can ride at any age. It's a service for everyone that lives in that particular county. And again, just changing people's mindsets.
Yeah. I think one of the ideas we've been touching on is, okay, so there may be some sort of cultural shift occurring, whether it's at a certain age break or generational break, or if it's just more people are recognizing that, regardless of the politics or of the science, that there is a warming occurring, right? And so we kind of I think most people have come to that recognition, right? Whether by hook or by crook. So then you go to the average citizen and say they want to reduce the number of vehicle miles traveled, both themselves and in their community. Where should they start? What is the easiest way? I like this idea of sort of the bite-sized look in some ways, which is more of, okay, the carpool one day, but what are some of the other things? And so that, as folks here go back to their communities, or folks that are listening to us, what can they do to help reduce both their own personal vehicle miles traveled as well as within their community. And you want to, Lydia, maybe start with that?
The first thing that came to mind was, for me, we do have a decent sidewalk network where I live. So if I'm going to CVS, I and my boys may walk instead of me driving the car. And I'll use them. If we go to the grocery store, you can carry a bag too. Whereas, ordinarily I may think I need to take my vehicle if I'm purchasing food for a large family or a family of 5. So to me, that's just one small change there, just walking instead of driving your car. And, it goes back, tying back to partnerships. There we go with the public health partner. So I just think, to me, that's just one easy example.
Yeah. Someone else?
I'll just say, and sort of picking up on that is, holding your elected officials accountable, especially your local ones. Make sure that they're building the kinds of communities. I'm really fortunate in my community in North Raleigh. The city came in and retrofit sidewalks into a community that did not have sidewalks. That's a big investment, and that was a decision that our local leaders made, and that makes our lives so much easier. I mean, those sidewalks are packed. We can walk to the grocery store now without worrying about, our kids being in the street. It's a huge change, and that's part of it, is where you invest. It can really make a difference.
And I know we've incentivized folks to walk more. Unfortunately, we're in Greenville is a little bit of a it's a hub and spoke. We're sort of the hub, right? So a lot of folks come in from a long way. So I can't say, walk to work from, Robertsonville, right? For those who are familiar with Eastern North Carolina. But when we get there, we do have a program in place. It's more for health benefits, but, why not have double, you sort of double benefits? I'm sort of thinking in my mind how I can sort of get that out to our folks as well, that, you don't have to hop in your car and drive, 500 yards to eat. So, Nina, maybe?
Well, I just agree with all the assessments so far, and just would support the idea that, to the degree, we tend in policy, in politics and policy, to be a little bit behind the public. The public for quite some time has been saying, we like greenways, we want sidewalks, we'd love to have some transportation choice. And we've just lagged behind that a little bit. And so I think, the encouraging people to really be engaged in transportation planning, which is very hard for a lot of people. Maybe I know the department has worked very hard to try to engage folks, in our digital world and so on. But just continuing to work the public involved, because the more support we have from the public, the easier it is for us as policymakers to make the decisions that I think are going to be required if we're going to make any significant shift in the future.
Patrick?
I think in looking through the VMT report that Heather and Colin were talking about as we started, something that I've seen work in the rural areas is a combination of a couple of things. It's the van pool idea, it's provided by the employer, and there's some sort of financial incentive to the user. That, if you ride this many days out of the 30-day month, you get some sort of financial incentive to do that. And whoever is driving the van, they get an additional, incentive for maintaining and driving the van. But it's tied to an employer, and you need that anchor employer, which is, in the rural areas, exactly what you need, because there's not necessarily in the towns that employment population that would work for a park and ride lot or something like that. But you get the van pool going, that everybody who works at this factory that's a 2,000 employee factory, you can get enough people together to fill that van up every day and make that make financial sense. And from the partnership aspect, you get that employer who now can advertise that they provide this service to their employees, and even potentially use it as a marketing tool for attracting additional millennials who are concerned about their carbon footprint. And you can say, hey, we have this van pool service that we offer to employees, and we're reducing carbon footprint by this much by doing that. And as people have all this work choice all of a sudden, that could be the difference between choosing company A and choosing company B.
That's right.
And what happens when that van is electric, right? What
There you
happens when
go.
that van's
Even
electric
more.
and autonomous? What happens when that van is the quadcopter that we saw, not too long ago? And all of a sudden, it's more than just, hopping in an Econoline, right? You're
Yep.
hopping in something that, appeals to, obviously a younger, but to everyone, right? It's a cool concept. It's clean. It's well run. So,
Yep, exactly.
Okay. Well, anybody have any kind of closing thoughts on our part, and then we're going to take it out for some questions. But anybody else have anything just to kind of say now? But you'll have plenty of time to speak to specific questions as well from the audience.
I'll just leave you with the idea of being nimble. I think we've got to be nimble. We've got to collaborate better. I think the future of growing an economy is the labor force. The labor force has certain demands, and if we want to have the labor force of the future, we need to provide choices and be ready to adapt to a changing world. So that's my last comment on this.
Yeah. Thank you. Anyone else? Okay. Well, that was really, really an exciting and helpful panel. Again, I love walking away from things with some sort of actionable items, and I hope everyone else feels that same way. I do know that we are going to open it up to the audience. To start, I think let's look at the results of the poll on the app. If we could bring that up, okay? Any chance we could get it on one of these screens here for the panelists? Well, I'll do my best to.
Oh, here, we got it right in the center screen. There you go, Tom.
Okay, great. So again, what do you believe is the biggest barrier to reducing vehicle miles traveled? By far the largest response was the personal attachment to driving, followed by public unwillingness to use public transit options, and that public transit isn't reaching far enough. And down a little bit further, you have difficulty in walking to destinations. Just a quick kind of a quick hit. What does this mean to our panel? Is this kind of the results that you would have expected for a question like this? And I'll start with Patrick, maybe.
I mean, I think that mirrors pretty well exactly our discussion that we just had. It's a lot about the education, and the top two are both education things, right? It's the getting people to change in the hearts and minds, getting people to leave their vehicle at home for a day, and also getting them to recognize that public transit is for everyone and available to everybody, and is a clean, safe way to get where you want to go.
Okay, Nina.
Agree, and I guess what I would say is until we really properly fund it, and so that it actually works well, we're not going to change any of those numbers, because who wants to go, even if it's your heart's desire to reduce your VMT and to make a difference on the planet, you're not going to take 5 hours out of your day to get on a bus to go somewhere and then get on another bus and go somewhere. I mean, until we properly fund things, as they do in other areas of our country and certainly other areas of the world, so that it's an exciting and efficient and good choice for someone in their day, then we're not going to change those numbers. But I think we can. I mean, I do think that the will is there. We certainly have, a significant amount of funding. I mean, sometimes the DOT budget is north of $5 billion. So we certainly can make some changes in order to adequately fund a robust transportation choice in our state.
Yeah. Lydia?
I just think the survey shows that maybe we've done a good job of building roads, but now's the time. Like we did what we set out to do, what we were going to do. So we've done that. So I just feel like even if I just talk about Greensboro, we are edging the completion of our urban loop. And so now it's just like, we're in a good strategic position really to shift gears and look at our other modes. Like we as Greensboro have always kind of been like, hey, we're going to get sidewalks in when we can. We're going to use CMAQ funding when we can for sidewalks. We try to be strategic in how we can get these other modes, make sure we keep our bus fleet turning over and getting the most up to date, whether it's clean diesel or electric vehicle bus all the way 100%. So we always are looking at different strategies. But as we go back to Nina's point, where she keeps emphasizing is the funding, because only so much percent that we're going to get from the state, right? And then that's what they get from the federal government. So it rolls down. And then I'm not going to leave out the locality. Our municipality has to step up too. So it's a combination. So Is there some education to the public? Yes, we kind of focus and talked a lot about getting the citizen to change, but then we have to talk about staff as well as council, as well as developers. Bo opened up about housing, where people, are developing, or where housing is, or housing shortages, or where they're building. So it's a whole lot, it's like two different sides to it. So it's like the user, but also the builders that we need to really start to educate and come together and see if we can come together on the same page. Then maybe those numbers or that survey response will change a little bit.
And to add a third side to that, and I've told this to most of the panelists that I've been able to talk to, when I first saw this, most of what we're talking about as it relates to VMTs within the department has been how we're going to monetize those as we move away from the gas tax. So, where does the funding, there's this cross, the accesses are crossing here, right? So I'm sure there's another panel that in this session, that has discussed very much that same thing. So just something to sort of keep in the back of our mind as we're reducing VMTs, which is absolutely the right thing to do. We've got to be really creative and really smart about how we keep our funding levels up to take advantage or to create the sort of transportation of the future, while at the same time reducing our footprint. I'm glad there's smarter people than me working on this. Bo?
Absolutely. No, and when you talk about VMT, I've been doing this work with cities for 20 years, and one of the primary reasons we talked about reducing VMT early on was its impact on the environment. And I think that's still true and that's still relevant, and we really do need to reduce VMT if we want to continue to protect our air quality and our water and the quality of life as well. But we're going to see changes as electrification begins to take hold, and I'm so excited about this state being a leader in that. I think that the governor's recent executive order, I think the fact that we've attracted one of the largest battery manufacturing facilities to North Carolina shows that this is a state where we're going to adapt to, and again, be nimble to adapt to change. But at the same time, that electrification poses great challenge to the funding for our transportation system. I guess I see Senator McGinnis here. We've talked about this a lot. We've got to change the way we finance transportation too. So that's one of the big changes. I will say one thing about the poll, and it says personal attachment to driving. I would maybe say personal attachment to driving / convenience. Because if you lose the ability to just jump in your car and go to the grocery store, that's a problem. But if we offer alternatives, suddenly it becomes easier. And maybe, talking about rural settings, if you could drive just 10 minutes to the train station in Selma, and then take the train to your job in Raleigh, and that train ride from Selma was spent on the phone, working on your computer, suddenly you're commuting, you're reducing your VMT, but you're also actually, if you're an attorney, you're billing your hours while you're driving, getting to work. You're not driving, you're commuting and billing your time. So that's, we need to show people those real life examples of ways they can change their lifestyle through reducing VMT.
Well, the good news is there's a lot of optionality there, right? It's not one or two choices. I mean, there's just dozens, whether it's zoning and density or actual uses. But as always, I feel like I talk too much and probably monopolized a good bit of the time here, but really appreciate it. I thought this was just a fantastic conversation. We do have a little bit of time for some questions. We'd love to turn it over to anyone that may have questions out in the audience. I see we've got 5 or 6 microphones set up. We've got a question here.
Yes, is great. I'm Sig Hutchinson. I'm chair of the Wake County Commission, also chair of Campo. Love the conversation, but would like to shift a bit to the conversation around land use, recognizing that transportation and land use is clearly integrated, and to talk about how land use can impact not only creating healthy communities, but make those transportation choices more preferred and easy in addition to be right. And what are the walkaways as policymakers that we want to think about leaving this summit about land use conversations that can impact VMTs?
My day job is in real estate development, so it's something that's near and dear to my heart. I think one of more interesting things, and this is not a novel approach, but it's certainly newer in North Carolina, is these transit-oriented developments where you essentially, allow for increases in density and height and other things that developers want greatly in exchange for being closer to mass transit, to providing easy accessibility to mass transit. And I think that's a really interesting. Again, that doesn't work in every town or city. It certainly is more difficult in rural areas, but in the capital area MPO, there are opportunities for that. I think that will go a long ways. That's a pretty narrow, both physically and sort of metaphorically, way to look at it. But there are a lot of opportunities there. Maybe Bo.
Yeah, as always, Sig gets right to the point. That's one of the key questions. And I think I mentioned earlier the fact that we have what I consider a fairly centralized management of transportation in North Carolina. We have, I think, our DOT is number 2 in terms of the miles that it handles and manages. But that does mean that we disconnect a lot of the transportation-specific decisions from the land use, because land use is a local prerogative. And I think the more that we can find ways, Sig, you know this as well as I do, the more we can blend transportation decisions with land use, that we better leverage. For example, if you invest in a highway, you don't want to screw up the interchanges and create congestion. That's a bad use of limited public resources. So the land use decisions around transportation. Another example, and you mentioned it, is transit-oriented development. The other side of that is also that we need to think about housing and how that relates to transit-oriented development, and make sure that you're thinking about affordable housing. And I know that that's one of the regrets I know that folks in Charlotte say, boy, I wish we'd had more affordable housing along our light rail line. And I'm hearing it here in Raleigh, that they really are committed to having affordable housing along those BRT lines. I think that makes transit much more effective. We get better bang for our buck when we invest in public transportation. So that's one of the challenges.
On the affordable, that world is very much, so much of the affordable is driven by the low-income housing tax credits, and they're scored, right? So putting more weight on mass transit is a great way to push, again, the development world into that. And so I don't know if there's folks out listening from the Housing Finance Agency or some other places, but, to add weight there. Maybe Lydia, a thought on this?
It's interesting because Bo talked about like NCDOT, the state, but even when we bring it down to the local level, just the coordination, and we try to, but we find that we're on 2 different cycles, right? So we may be updating the travel demand model, and we'll pull information in, but someone at the last, I think, session was talking about when they updated their comp plan, things change so quickly. So it's almost like have to be constant, or they have to be intertwined. A tool that we're starting to use in the Piedmont Tri-Region is Community Viz, and there's a big push for us to be able to use it. Hannah, our current director, was there when we first started using it. So there's a big push, and this could possibly be a way for us to see, okay, if we make this land use decision, how will this impact transportation? How will this impact transit with other tools? So it has to be kind of getting on the same timeline to be able to make those things work together and make the best decisions. And even I think about like where we locate schools.
Yeah.
We have magnet schools, you have charter schools, you may drive several, versus your neighborhood school. But where do schools try to locate? Usually where it's kind of cost effective, those types of things. So it's so many things and factors and players that we would have to pull together and say,
Thank you. Nina or Patrick, a specific response?
I just think, we often think about rural areas as, just wide open country, but, we have towns too. They may not be big, but, there still is a central business district, if you will. There is a lot of potential for quick zoning fixes, changes. Height restrictions is something that you mentioned that just gets you density right away. A lot of small towns feel like they need to keep the height down for some reason, and that doesn't necessarily need to be the case. Mixed use development, making these things just a little bit easier for the developers can go a long way in just giving that central business district a little bit of more density, and now all of a sudden your transit makes sense.
And at the same time, making it a little bit more arduous to do the more sprawling and more negative impactful.
You know, the mention of schools was a great one.
Yeah.
I mean, there, you know, you just find the cheapest land out in the country, and now all of a sudden there's no neighborhoods around, and everybody's
Coming in.
driving to this place that's not close to anything else, and then driving back away.
I'll just add to, when you think about land use, you also need to think about the way you design transportation projects. I mean, when you're building a bridge over a highway in an urban setting, you better make sure you think of having sidewalks so that you're not creating a barrier to people moving from one side to the other. I mean, historically, certainly highway development has created some barriers between communities. They've disrupted communities. I think, and our DOT, I think, has really made tremendous progress in working with people like Patrick and his colleagues at the MPOs and designing our transportation projects to accommodate neighborhoods and the livability in those neighborhoods, while also trying to move, you know, vehicles in and out of communities. So that's been a big challenge.
We've got another question here.
Thank you. Kim Hunza with Southern Environmental Law Center. I really appreciate the discussion today. It's a really important one to be having right now. In Governor Cooper's executive order 246 from the week before last, one of the things he does is mandate agencies to consider the social cost of carbon and incorporate that into their decision making. Do you think there is a way to do that and other types of cost-benefit analyses which are going to help us better prioritize projects at DOT?
Wow.
You know, so Bo and I are on the SPOT work group, which is the group that gets together every other year to look at the data points and the formulas that go into scoring all the projects to see what gets funded. One of the big pushes between the last round and our upcoming round is a couple of research projects that are specifically looking at how do we calculate environmental justice factors in transportation projects, and looking to integrate that into the scoring so that you will score higher if you are, you know, advantaging those particular areas of the state. And I think that's going to be a huge step in answering that exact question.
Patrick nailed it, as always.
Yeah, not unexpected. I mean, you're quite close to all that, Nina.
I would just like to add that, and this really piggybacks on what was said earlier by Kim and others, that I was always so struck. We would have a presentation from our comptroller, and we'd look at our revenue, and when gas tax revenues were down, which meant people were using less gasoline and burning less gasoline, that was a negative. And that just seemed like such a contrary thing from a policy perspective. Why would we want people to use less gas? Well, we want people to use less gas because that's how we make our money in order to fund our transportation system. So I think that having the right kind of incentives in place for us as policymakers, the work that you guys are doing on SPOT is absolutely spot on in terms of how we use our funding prioritization to support our values. And one value would be reducing VMT and reduce GHG. If we embed those values in our scoring system, we might end up closer to where we want to be.
Well said. Lydia, we're not hearing you.
I think we've lost her.
I hate to stop her in the middle of it. What do you think?
Lydia, I don't think we can hear you. Are you on mute?
No. Oh, I'm sorry. Bo, any?
No, I just sort of big picture question. You really do measure commitment on where you invest. And if you invest in providing choices to the citizens of North Carolina, how they move things in themselves from one place to the other, I think that will show that we're ready to adapt to a changing world. It will allow citizens and people all across the state to have the choices they need, and it'll create opportunities. I have two 20-somethings, my son and daughter. My daughter lives in a major northeastern city. She doesn't even own a car. So we need to accommodate that mindset. My son has lived overseas. He comes back to the U.S. and all he wants to do is take a train everywhere. He doesn't want to get into a car either. So I think the more that we can accommodate the changing demographics and invest in the kinds of things that make us more attractive for the future, the better off we're going to be.
I hate to keep going back to this idea of sort of the lighter lift or the bite size, but you know, I wonder if there's a way to almost focus, because I think it's much easier to provide the alternatives for someone who is single and, you know, sort of focused on their career. It's a much different audience if you talk about someone that's, you know, got 3 children, right? I mean, it's a much harder ask. Or, you know, to an empty nester, it's a much easier ask. So it's almost like, is there a way to focus on that and enable the folks who may be a little closer to that being very convenient, or not inconvenient at the very least, versus maybe that segment that, I mean, it is very inconvenient, you know, to the Wilson analogy, or the Wilson story earlier, you know, that, you know, to use public transportation to get a kid, pick up a child from school, get them to the doctor, get them back to the house is a tough sell, but there are parts of it that are not nearly as tough. So that's just an interesting thought. Additional questions out there? I don't see anyone. Thank you to those of you who asked. Thank you to everyone for participating in this, both in the poll and just listening to us. Our panelists, Nina, Lydia, Bo, and Patrick, really appreciate it. You enabled me to sound like I knew what I was doing, which is really great. Now, for the best part, lunch is being served in the exhibit hall downstairs. Everyone, I encourage you to please talk to the sponsors, talk to the vendors during that break. This is the last chance for it. Without them, this event doesn't occur. Without you, this event doesn't occur either. But, you know, take advantage of it. They've got really cool stuff. And just thank you guys so very much. Have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you guys very much. That was really nice.